You want to know what's real? Avoidant people don't change because you love them harder. They don't wake up one day and magically become secure because you waited, begged, or proved your worth. But here's the twist. Some of them do come back, and when they do, it's not for the reason you think. Today, I'm going to break down exactly what actually works straight from the words of a 100% avoidant who did return. No fluff, no fantasy, just truth. If you've been stuck in anxiety, chasing validation, or wondering if your story will be different, you need to hear this, because it's not about changing them. It's about what shifts when you stop chasing and start choosing yourself. Let's get into it. When avoidant individuals come back, it's not because someone chased them down or proved their loyalty beyond reason. It's because they finally felt emotionally safe. And that kind of safety doesn't come from constant contact, reassurance, or emotional overexposure. In fact, it's often the opposite. Emotional safety to an avoidant means space. It means quiet. It means that their nervous system isn't being overwhelmed by someone else's emotional needs that they feel unprepared to meet.
That might sound frustrating if you've been on the anxious end of the dynamic, craving closeness, conversation, and emotional availability, but it's the truth. Avoidants often grew up in environments where vulnerability either wasn't safe or wasn't rewarded. They learned often early that emotions were either dismissed, punished, or ignored, so they coped by withdrawing, by becoming hyper-independent, by learning to self-regulate without needing others.
When they feel someone pushing emotionally, even with good intentions, it can trigger that old protective wiring. They might interpret connection as pressure, intimacy as control, and caring as suffocation. So they pull away, not necessarily because they don't care, but because care feels risky. If you feel like you're starting to connect the dots and open your heart in a new way, subscribe and stay close. We're just getting started. This kind of feminine healing and empowerment, it changes everything. Now, when someone steps back from chasing them, when they stop over-explaining, stop trying to fix the relationship, stop begging for clarity or change, something interesting happens. The avoidant person's system begins to calm down. That fight or flight reflex they've been living in starts to settle without the emotional noise they were trying to escape. They begin to feel. And that's when memory kicks in. They start to reflect. They notice what's missing. They remember the good moments, the connection, the way they felt cared for, but now without the pressure. And that's often the moment when they start to come back. Not because someone did more, but because someone finally did less in the right way. But here's where it gets important. Emotional safety isn't about walking on eggshells or being hyper-tolerant of avoidant behavior. It's not about making yourself small to avoid triggering them. That's not emotional safety. That's self-abandonment. True emotional safety is created when both people can exist without trying to manage or control each other's emotions. And for someone avoidant, the only way they learn this is by experiencing it firsthand. When the person they left stops trying to pull them back and instead holds their own space peacefully, confidently, without punishment or pleading, it sends a new message: I'm not a threat. I don't need to control you to feel okay. That's powerful. That's when the avoidant feels something they rarely do in relationships. Freedom without abandonment. They feel connection without pressure. And in that space, curiosity can replace defensiveness. Desire can reemerge without the fear of being engulfed. This is where a shift can begin, but only when the anxious counterpart steps into their own healing too. It's not easy to create emotional safety for someone else while protecting your own peace. It takes self-awareness, boundaries, and often deep inner work. But that's the paradox. When you finally stop trying to convince someone to stay, you create the exact condition that makes them want to come closer. So, emotional safety isn't about doing more to soothe them. It's about doing enough to center yourself. That steadiness is what changes the dynamic, not by force, not by manipulation, but by creating an environment where connection can actually feel safe for both people. That's when things start to shift. That's when avoidants come back. Not because they were convinced, but because they felt something they didn't expect. Calm, connection, and choice, all in one place. When avoidants return, one of the most consistent things they mention is how the space after the separation gave them time to reflect, not just on the relationship, but on themselves. It might feel counterintuitive, especially if you're someone who associates love with closeness, communication, and working things out in real time. But for avoidants, space is often the only environment where real insight can happen. It's not because they don't care. It's because when they're in the thick of emotional intensity, especially the kind that comes from anxious or highly expressive partners, their system goes into shutdown. They aren't processing. They're escaping. They aren't thinking clearly. They're reacting based on habit, on survival mode. So when things go quiet, when the texts stop, when no one is demanding answers or chasing connection, that's when something starts to shift. The silence that you might interpret as disconnection or indifference can actually become a mirror for the avoidant person. They're no longer fending off emotional demands or trying to assert their independence. Suddenly, they have nothing to defend themselves against, and in that space, real reflection begins. Avoidants often need to reconnect with their own emotions. It sounds strange, but closeness, especially emotional intensity, can make them feel like they're losing themselves. When someone is constantly needing reassurance or closeness, it can activate deep-seated fears that their autonomy is under threat. So they pull away, hoping that space will help them feel in control again. But what they often don't expect is what happens when that space turns into silence. When the other person stops showing up, stops reaching out, stops trying to repair things for both of them, it creates a vacuum. And in that stillness, their thoughts start catching up to them. And if this conversation stirred something in you, if your soul whispered yes, even through the ache, then stay close. Subscribe for more of these love realignments, not from a place of desperation, but from devotion to the woman you're becoming. They might remember moments that didn't seem important at the time. A look, a gesture, a conversation. These details start to resurface without being clouded by the pressure they felt during the relationship. They begin to feel the absence of the connection in a way that isn't just relief. It's awareness. They realize what's gone. They start to question their own actions. They notice the emotional comfort that used to be there, now replaced with quiet, and slowly their narrative begins to change. This isn't to romanticize avoidance or suggest that all avoidants will do this kind of reflection. Many don't. But among those who do come back, the common thread is this. Space gave them clarity. Clarity they couldn't find while they were overwhelmed. Clarity they needed in order to see not just the flaws in the relationship, but the ways they contributed to the disconnection. This is critical because change doesn't come from guilt or from being persuaded. It comes from self-realization, and self-realization requires stillness. But here's the catch. That space can only spark reflection if the other person truly lets go. Not pretending to let go while secretly hoping they'll come back. Not maintaining quiet but still watching their every move online. True detachment, emotional release. When the avoidant senses they are no longer being pursued or emotionally depended on, it gives them the opportunity to choose not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but from a place of agency. That's when it matters. Because when someone chooses to come back after reflection, it's not reactive, it's intentional. And that intention is everything. It doesn't mean they've magically healed or transformed, but it does mean something has shifted. They've seen the relationship and themselves from a new vantage point. And now, if they return, it's not to escape loneliness or to pacify someone else. It's because space gave them enough room to see clearly, and what they saw made them want to reconnect. So, if you're in that space right now, if you're in the quiet, if you've stepped back, know that it isn't empty. It's working. Maybe not in the way you want or expect, But space has power, not because it creates longing, but because it creates perspective. And for someone whose default is avoidance, perspective is often the first real step toward change. When avoidants come back, they don't return because someone convinced them through perfect behavior, constant reassurance, or emotional effort that felt like a performance. They come back when they believe they saw the real you, not the version of you trying to earn their love, prove your worth, or say all the right things to avoid being abandoned. What actually breaks through their emotional distance is authenticity. Not strategy, not manipulation, not acting secure when you're secretly falling apart, but raw, grounded, unapologetic truth. That's what sticks in their mind when you're gone. That's what they reflect on when they have space. Avoidants are not blind. They can feel when someone is overcompensating, even if they don't consciously process it that way. When you're twisting yourself to keep them close, always agreeable, always patient, always available, they sense it. And instead of pulling them in, it can actually push them further away. Why? Because on a deep level, it reinforces their belief that relationships mean pressure, performance, and emotional debt. It makes them feel like they're being trapped into a role they didn't ask for, like they owe something in return. And avoidants don't want to feel indebted. They want to feel free. That's why authenticity is so important. When someone stops trying to be the perfect partner and instead starts being real, setting boundaries, expressing truth without trying to control the outcome, showing emotion without expecting it to be managed or fixed, it disrupts the pattern. It tells the avoidant, this person is not here to mold themselves into what I need. They're just being themselves. And that's where respect begins to build. Avoidants may struggle with emotional intimacy, but they are often drawn to people who are emotionally honest because that kind of honesty creates clarity, and clarity is what they crave, even if they don't know how to ask for it. Authenticity also creates a powerful contrast. When someone has been anxiously attached, they often show up in relationships with masks, smiling when they're hurting, downplaying their needs, making everything about the other person to feel safe. But when that person finally drops the performance, not in a bitter or punishing way, but in a calm, grounded way, the dynamic shifts. They're no longer trying to manage the avoidant, they're just existing fully in their truth. And that presence lingers, it leaves a mark. Avoidants may not respond to emotional displays in the moment. They may not validate your truth when you speak it, but they hear it. And more importantly, they remember it, especially when the noise dies down and they start replaying the relationship in their head. It's often in hindsight that they finally register the power of what you said, how you said it, and how different it felt from the emotional performances they've seen before. Because authentic people don't chase, they don't beg, they don't try to be perfect, they express, they own, and they let go. Letting go is a key part of authenticity. When you're being real, you don't cling to outcomes. You don't manipulate for a specific reaction. You say what's true because it's true, not because you're hoping it will make someone stay. And that kind of emotional independence is magnetic. It's the opposite of what avoidants expect. They anticipate emotional entanglement, demands, control. But when they see someone showing up in their full truth and then walking away with self-respect, it creates impact. It's not about proving value. It's about living your value. So if you're wondering what actually works with avoidance, it's not about becoming who you think they want. It's about becoming who you really are, even if that risks the connection. Because ironically, it's that risk, that bravery, that openness without demand that avoidants remember. And when they do come back, it's not because you played it right. It's because they finally saw someone who didn't need to be chosen to stand tall. And that kind of person doesn't just earn respect. They invite return not through pressure, but through presence. One of the most challenging yet transformative steps when dealing with avoidant partners is learning the power of detachment. This idea is often misunderstood. Detachment doesn't mean indifference or giving up on someone you care about. It's not about shutting down your feelings or becoming cold. Instead, detachment is about stepping back emotionally, releasing the need to control the outcome, and reclaiming your own peace, regardless of what the avoidant does. For many people who love avoidance, especially those with anxious attachment styles, this is a seismic shift. It means letting go of the frantic chase, the constant worry, and the endless need for reassurance, even when the heart screams to hold on tighter. If this conversation stirred something in you, if your soul whispered yes, even through the ache, then stay close. Subscribe for more of these love realignments, not from a place of desperation, but from devotion to the woman you're becoming. Avoidants are wired to pull away when they sense someone becoming too emotionally dependent on them. They don't want to feel trapped or responsible for someone else's emotional state. When a partner is constantly reaching out, pushing for closeness, or trying to fill the avoidant's emotional gaps, it can trigger their instinct to escape. This pushes the avoidant further into their protective shell, and the cycle repeats. What breaks this pattern is when the other person practices detachment, when they stop feeding the chase and instead focus on themselves. Detachment is not about abandoning the relationship or refusing to engage. It's about creating emotional boundaries that protect your well-being. It's about recognizing that you cannot force someone else to change or love you in the way you want. And the moment you accept this truth, something powerful happens. Instead of clinging, you start choosing yourself. Instead of fear-driven actions, you move with intention. Instead of anxiety, you cultivate calm. This shift doesn't just benefit you. It changes how the avoidant perceives you. When you are emotionally detached in this healthy way, you become less of a pressure point for the avoidant. They no longer feel responsible for your emotional state. They can breathe, and breathing space is exactly what they need to soften their defenses. It's a paradox. The more you let go, the more the avoidant may come closer, but only because it's a choice they feel safe making, not because they were pushed or pulled. Detachment also invites respect. When someone stops chasing approval or begging for connection and instead stands firm in their self-worth, it communicates something very different to an avoidant person. It says, I respect myself enough to walk away if I'm not treated well. That message is often missing in avoidant dynamics where one partner is desperate for connection and the other is desperate for space. When both partners learn detachment, it creates balance. This balance doesn't mean no emotional intimacy. In fact, detachment can deepen intimacy because it comes from a place of emotional honesty rather than neediness. It means you show up as your whole self without being dependent on the avoidant to fill your emotional tank. You can share your feelings, but you're not desperate for them to respond in a specific way. You can love someone without losing yourself. Practicing detachment takes work, especially if you've spent a long time in anxious patterns. It requires self-awareness, self-compassion, and often support from others or professional guidance. It means learning to tolerate uncertainty and discomfort without collapsing into fear or control. It means trusting that your worth doesn't depend on another person's presence or approval. But when you reach that place, you create an environment where avoidance can truly show up. Not because they feel cornered, but because they feel invited. That invitation comes from a place of freedom, not obligation. It's the difference between being pulled by chains and walking hand in hand. So detachment is not giving up. It's gaining freedom. Freedom from anxiety, freedom from control, freedom from the exhausting emotional roller coaster. And ironically, that freedom often creates the very conditions that allow avoidance to come back. Not because you begged, pleaded, or tried harder, but because you respected yourself enough to let go. When you let go, you actually hold on to your power, and that power changes everything. When it comes to reconnecting with avoidant partners, consistency is often the unsung hero that makes a real difference. This doesn't mean constantly bombarding them with calls, texts, or emotional demands. In fact, the opposite is true. Avoidants are triggered by chaos, unpredictability, and emotional volatility. What they crave, even if they can't always articulate it, is steady, reliable presence, a calm anchor in the storm. Consistency is the quiet force that gradually chips away at their defenses, proving over time that you're not going anywhere and that you can be trusted. Avoidant individuals often come from backgrounds where emotional unpredictability was the norm. Maybe caregivers were inconsistent, loving one moment, distant the next. Maybe they experienced emotional neglect or sudden withdrawals that made them hypervigilant and guarded. Because of this, their nervous systems are wired to brace for instability. When someone in their life behaves inconsistently, their internal alarm bells ring. They feel unsafe, and the easiest way to protect themselves is to pull back, sometimes abruptly. Consistency then becomes a form of safety. When you show up in a way that's predictable and reliable, it helps regulate their emotional system. It says, I am here. I am steady. You don't have to guess or brace yourself. This doesn't mean you need to be perfect or never make mistakes. Avoidants understand imperfection. What matters is that over time, your actions align with your words, your presence matches your promises, and your energy remains steady. This builds trust, the kind of trust that allows them to lower their walls, even if just a little. But consistency isn't about controlling them or forcing closeness. It's about holding your ground with your own emotions and behaviors. It means responding with patience instead of frustration when they pull away. It means keeping your boundaries firm but fair. It means showing respect for their need for space without feeling rejected. This kind of emotional maturity sends a powerful message that you're not reactive or desperate. You're someone who can be counted on no matter what. Importantly, consistency is also about pacing. Avoidants often struggle with feeling overwhelmed by emotional intensity or too much too fast. When you rush closeness or push for commitment prematurely, it can trigger retreat. But when you're consistent in your calm, measured approach, it gives them time to adjust. It's like slowly turning down the volume on chaos, letting them acclimate to connection without feeling pressure. This steady presence also gives avoidants permission to show up gradually and authentically. They don't have to pretend or perform to meet your expectations because your consistency creates a safe container for them to explore vulnerability at their own pace. Over time, the walls they build to protect themselves can soften. Not because they were forced down, but because they learned that being close doesn't mean losing control. One of the biggest mistakes people make is equating grand gestures or intense efforts with love and commitment. Avoidants usually don't respond well to drama or highs and lows. They respond to the quieter, steadier signals of reliability. That's why small, consistent actions like following through on what you say, maintaining your own emotional balance, and showing up with calm patience can mean far more than dramatic displays. Consistency also protects your own emotional health. When you commit to showing up steadily, you reduce the emotional roller coaster that comes from reacting impulsively to avoidance or rejection. You create a rhythm that supports your well-being and prevents burnout. This balanced approach makes it more sustainable to maintain connection without losing yourself. It's important to remember that consistency is a long game. It doesn't guarantee immediate change or quick reconciliation. Avoidants move slowly, and sometimes they test boundaries or retreat multiple times. But over time, consistent presence builds an invisible thread of trust and safety that they can't easily ignore. So if you're in a relationship with an avoidant or trying to rebuild one, focus less on intense emotional pushes and more on reliable, steady connection. Be the calm in the chaos. Be the presence that doesn't demand, but quietly invites. Over time, that consistent energy creates a foundation strong enough to support real intimacy. even with someone who's been guarded for a long time. If this conversation stirred something in you, if your soul whispered yes, even through the ache, then stay close. Subscribe for more of these love realignments, not from a place of desperation, but from devotion to the woman you're becoming. In the end, consistency isn't flashy or dramatic. It's simple, patient, and unwavering. But that's exactly why it works. It shows avoidance that you're someone who can be counted on, someone who respects their needs and boundaries, and someone who isn't going anywhere. And that kind of trust, that's what real connection is built on. One of the most powerful forces that draws avoidant individuals back is self-respect. This may seem surprising because so often the narrative around relationships with avoidance focuses on chasing, fixing, or changing them. But what actually makes a lasting impact is when you stand firmly in your own worth and refuse to settle for less than you deserve. Self-respect isn't about arrogance or selfishness. It's about honoring your own needs, setting boundaries, and refusing to compromise your integrity to keep someone in your life. When you embody this, it sends a clear message to avoidants that you value yourself, and paradoxically, that makes you more valuable to them. Avoidants are wired to pull away from emotional demands and pressures. When someone is desperate for their attention or approval, it activates their deepest fears of engulfment and loss of autonomy. They see that desperation as a form of control, and their instinct is to flee. But when someone approaches the relationship from a place of self-respect, it changes the dynamic completely. It says, I am whole and worthy whether you are here or not. I will not sacrifice my peace or boundaries to keep you close. This kind of energy is disarming to avoidants because it's the opposite of what they expect. Instead of being chased or controlled, they encounter someone who stands steady in their truth. Self-respect manifests in many ways, through clear boundaries, consistent actions, and emotional honesty. It means you don't accept mistreatment, manipulation, or silence as a norm. It means you communicate your needs without apology and hold your ground when those needs aren't met. This firmness can be scary to an avoidant at first because it breaks the familiar pattern of push-pull, chase-withdrawal, but over time, it creates a new kind of respect. They start to see you not as someone to manage or escape from, but as someone who demands to be seen and treated well. When you practice self-respect, you also model healthy behavior. Avoidants, like anyone else, are influenced by what they experience in relationships. If all they've known is chaos or emotional enmeshment, seeing someone who is grounded, centered, and self-aware provides a new blueprint. It shows them that connection doesn't have to mean losing oneself or sacrificing boundaries. It invites them to consider a different way of relating, one that includes respect for both partners' needs. Importantly, self-respect isn't about being rigid or unyielding. It's about balance, standing firm but with compassion, holding your boundaries while remaining open to dialogue and growth. It means knowing when to engage and when to walk away, and doing so with dignity. This balance demonstrates emotional strength, and avoidants are often drawn to strength because it feels less threatening than neediness or chaos. Another critical aspect of self-respect is the willingness to prioritize your own healing and growth. Avoidants are often reluctant to face emotional pain or vulnerability. But when you commit to your own journey, seeking support, learning about yourself, and cultivating emotional resilience, it shifts the dynamic. It shows that you are not dependent on their presence to be whole. That independence can inspire avoidants to engage differently, sometimes even to consider their own growth in the relationship. Self-respect also prevents you from falling into the trap of settling for less than you deserve. It's easy to get caught in cycles of hoping that if you just try harder, love more, or give more, the avoidant will change. But without self-respect, that hope can lead to pain, exhaustion, and loss of identity. When you honor yourself, you refuse to tolerate patterns that diminish you, no matter how much you care for the other person. This refusal is a form of self-love that cannot be ignored. Finally, self-respect is magnetic. It's the quiet confidence that doesn't need validation from others. It's the energy that says, I am enough as I am. Avoidants, who often struggle with their own fears of inadequacy and vulnerability, can sense this authenticity. It draws them in because it feels safe. It feels like a space where they don't have to perform or hide. And in that space, real connection becomes possible. So when avoidants come back, it's often not because they were convinced by words or promises, but because they recognize the strength and self-respect in the other person. They saw someone who wasn't afraid to walk away, someone who valued themselves too much to settle for less. That recognition can open doors to a new kind of relationship, one built not on chasing or fleeing, but on mutual respect, trust, and genuine connection. In the end, self-respect is the foundation that holds everything else together. It's the core that keeps you grounded when uncertainty hits. And for avoidance, it's often the catalyst that transforms fear into curiosity and distance into closeness. Without it, relationships with avoidance tend to repeat painful cycles. With it, they have the potential to evolve into something healthier, more secure, and deeply fulfilling. To wrap it all up, the journey with avoidance isn't about chasing or changing them. It's about showing up with authenticity, patience, and respect for both yourself and the space they need. When you step into your own power, practice healthy detachment, and stay consistent without losing your sense of self, you create the conditions for true connection to emerge. Avoidants come back not because of pressure or perfection, but because they see and feel your genuine strength and self-respect. This isn't just about rekindling a relationship. It's about transforming how you relate to yourself and to others so that any connection you build is rooted in trust, freedom, and mutual understanding. And that ultimately is what lasting love looks like. And if this conversation stirred something in you, if your soul whispered yes even through the ache, then stay close. Subscribe for more of these love realignments, not from a place of desperation, but from devotion to the woman you're becoming.